Hare Hare Om Namaha Om Hare Vidasyam Mama Sarva Rakshangniastangri Padmaha Padagendra Prishte Durai Tramasi Gadesha Chapa Pashanthano Ashtagano Ashtabahu Om Namo Narayanaya Om Hrang Hring Hrung Om Namo Bhagavate Hrishikeshaya. We need to understand the proper meaning and application of the Guru's provisions, as opposed to being bamboozled by a perverted reflection of such divisions which winds up in absurdity. Shankaracharya based his philosophy and Siddhanta on Vivartavad. This entailed, however, the provisional acceptance of the authority of the Vedic texts. That's the wrong conception of the Guru's provisions. We shall be discussing the correct conceptions of the Guru's provisions as this session continues. Because that provisional acceptance of the Vedic texts, which Vaishnavas don't engage in provisional acceptance, because it is inherently flawed, the Western philosophers and professors decided to change it in order to accommodate their very cherished theory of relativism. In the Vedanta of the great spiritual leader Shankaracharya, everything in the world is considered illusory. Shankar was an incarnation of Lord Shiva, sent into human society for the purposes of uprooting Buddhism and replacing it with his interpretation of the Vedic truths. But his interpretation was considered and called actually in the Padma Purana as covered Buddhism, because they shared that concept that everything in the world is illusory. Or as the Beatles sang in the song Strawberry Fields Forever, nothing is real and nothing to get hung up about. But this is not the actual teaching of the Vedic texts. Nevertheless, although the Buddhists, of course, completely rejected the Vedic texts, Shankaracharya provisionally accepted them. He considered that they represented an authority and a provisional reality. In other words, he taught his disciples that until full realization was attained, until they realized themselves as non-different from Brahman, which was considered to be the highest impersonal truth possible, which is also wrong philosophy, but until full realization was attained, then the illusory nature of the Vedic texts could not be considered. They had to be given provisional acceptance. So, instead of an objective reality that's integral to an established world order, the modern seers have decided to accept Vivartavad for exactly what it says, namely that everything is illusory, including the Vedic texts. So now they have supposedly upgraded the teachings of their cherished leader, Shankaracharya. We're talking in the West here, the philosophers and the professors, not those who are in the line of Shankara, the four lines in India. And they've upgraded it, supposedly upgraded it, so that now you can get benefit from the Vedic texts only if you believe in them. And this, of course, allows an individual personality immersed in Maya to create his or her own reality And that verges dangerously close to the philosophy of solipsism, which is arguably the worst philosophy on the face of the earth. So this is the pitfall of a wrong understanding of the Guru's provisions. In this case, the actual provision is false itself because Vedic texts are not supposed to be accepted provisionally. In other words, what we're teaching in these sessions is from Prabhupada's words, and these kinds of false provisions are inherently flawed provisions, or conceptions related to inherently flawed provisions or their misunderstandings, was not present in the words and teachings of His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada. We can take one example of this preliminarily, and that is a letter that Prabhupada received from his very first initiated disciple. He received this letter in May of 1974, and that disciple had been initiated by His Divine Grace in India in the early 50s. So the letter, which we do not have access to, we have access to Prabhupada's reply to it, which I shall read momentarily. But the letter apparently had ideas and proposals for service which Prabhupada provisionally accepted. This is May 4th, 1974. Prabhupada writes back, and I still maintain the feeling, hoping you will be a great help in the Krishna consciousness movement. The ideas given by you are provisionally accepted, and it is possible for us to join together. Still, we need to meet to talk in detail. Now, this particular Brahmin was never actually active in Prabhupada's movement, either while His Divine Grace was physically manifest, or after he departed. None of his Western disciples have ever known of any tangible service produced and executed by this particular Brahmin. And hardly any of Prabhupada's Western initiated disciples even knew of this fellow's existence, what to speak of having met him, although your host is an exception to this. The point of the matter is that his proposals were accepted provisionally for a reason, and when we discuss and analyze Prabhupada's use of the preposition if, which means that something is provisional, we need to have the right perspective. We do not want to mix it up with provisionality such as the provisionality that Shankaracharya said that the Vedic texts had in terms of their authority. We don't want to mix these things. We want to have the proper understanding of the use of the preposition if. The point is that Prabhupada made numerous entreaties to his godbrothers, one or two entreaties to leaders of other movements, so-called spiritual movements, or perhaps if you want to be liberal to say they're spiritual movements or were spiritual movements. He made entreaties to his sons to join him in his movement, and he also made entreaties to his initiated disciples. And in many of these cases, in particular with his godbrothers in all the cases, because none of his godbrothers ever joined his movement or performed any tangible service, they did a little service for him, one or two of them, but not much. So we have to understand that when he made these entreaties, even if he spoke as if this is to be done, or this is being done, or this will be done, all of these proposals were provisional, because Prabhupada, being fully realized, fully self-realized, fully God-realized, fully immersed in Krishna prema, was easily able to discern that the follow-through would not be there in many cases, perhaps most cases, perhaps the great majority of cases. And therefore, we need to get this proper understanding of the application of the Guru's provisions, especially in the context of how Prabhupada gave them. In other words, both God and the devil are in the details. We just read there in the last sentence to that letter of his first initiated disciple that we have to discuss the details. And everything remains provisional until the Guru is confident that those details are being implemented in the right way, in a way that synchronizes with the approval and pleasure of the Paramatma. So in our last session last month, we discussed the first 7 of 28, provisional, use of the word if. Now in this session, we shall proceed to 7 more, numbers 8 through 14. Eventually, we're going to discuss 28 of them, as you know. This first one was a letter to one of his initial disciples. This was well before the governing body had been created. This was in January of 1968, where he says to this disciple, who had opened up a temple for him, "If we are satisfied with plain living, with minimum time, and the balanced time is engaged for elevating our Krishna conscious program, then every man can be transferred to Goloka Vrindavan just in this very life." So as we see here in this letter, it's very sanguine. It's very optimistic and hopeful, but it says, if we can live the simple life. Living the simple life means simple living and high thinking, but high thinking does not mean sophisticated thinking. A devotee of Vaishnava is always unsophisticated. You should be able to understand a Vaishnava very easily because he's simple. He's not a simpleton. He understands the intricacies of the science of Krishna consciousness, the stages of Atmarama, but he lives simply in the material world. He doesn't get entangled in the complications of various deceptions, quote unquote, for Krishna. This is not the way. Simple means arjavam, honest, straightforward. Actually, arjavam can even mean simple in some cases, but it definitely means honest. So becoming entangled in the complications of misusing intelligence, how to make money in so many different sophisticated ways, telling lies in America, going out for Krishna and lying constantly and constantly trying to figure out ways to cheat the Vikarmis out of their money, supposedly because the money's going to be given to honest devotees. But was it? Was it given to honest devotees? We've had a number of these sessions now, and many of you who have listened to them have also read Prabhupada's letters. And we have discussed how he was so greatly displeased, especially starting in the mid-70s, how his disciples were involved in rascal activities. If you get engaged in complications, entangled in complications, under the rationalization that, oh, yeah, I'm making this money, but I'm giving it up, so I'm renounced. But who do you give it up to? Do you give it up to a sahajya? If you give it up to a sahajya, then that's like giving a donation on the street to a bum who will use the money to buy wine. You're going to get entangled in reactions. So, the point here, he says, we can all become transferred to Goloka Vrindavan. That means with the transcendental television, becoming a pure devotee by the benediction of the pure devotee who's already there. But it requires, he says, living simply, It was an if. If we. But was this done? Does the history show that this was done? Does the history show that in these temples there are many simple devotees who are living simply? It does not. Therefore, the provision not being met, how many devotees were given the benediction of the transcendental television? How many devotees were qualified to actually be guru? Did Prabhupada name any gurus? He named Ritviks, but Ritviks don't automatically become gurus. They can be called Ritvik Acharyas, but they're not a Diksha Acharya, they're not a Diksha Guru. They perform some subsidiary service while the real guru initiates the devotee who's the Yajamana. So let us proceed to the next letter. So it will be a great event if the Beatles try to understand this science of Krishna consciousness with intelligent questions and try to understand it and take it seriously. The public is in need of such songs, and if they are administered through nice agents like the Beatles, it will surely be a great success. On the whole, we cannot say that the Beatles actually represented Krishna consciousness. George Harrison, of course, did after the Beatles broke off. But the if was not, the provision of the statement has to be understood. Songs such as Strawberry Fields Forever, which projects the Buddhist misconception, are not helpful. They may give a false sense of serenity, but the concepts are not Vedic, they're not Vaishnav, they're not the absolute truth, and they eventually produce a kind of existential absurdity, which then leads somebody who believes in them, based on the great tunes and the great philosophy that was put forward in the tunes, so-called great philosophy. Such a person will be misled, but not be able to trace back, walk back the cat and figure out how he or she was misled. Prabhupada wanted these influential musicians in the 60s and early 70s to become Krishna conscious and represent his Siddhanta in their songs, in which case the vast majority of the people in America, young people, in the Western world, of Europe to a lesser extent, who considered these rock artists to be gurus in effect, although they may not have called them that, but they were worshiping them on stage in a tremendous fashion, and they were immersed in the message music that they produced, those recording artists. And yes, there was some gyan, no doubt about it, some very valuable gyan as far as gyan goes. But we need more than just that. In order to realize the absolute truth, in order to become an actual devotee of the absolute truth and engage in seva, you need to have the impetus of faith in the process. You need to have good association of sadhus, Vaishnavas who are already somewhat advanced or preferably very advanced. Just by hearing lyrics and saying, wow, that's far out, all right, there's a little value to that. You might give up some bad habits, you might give up some bad association, but it didn't totally play out that way, did it? The point of the matter is that, once again, we see an example where Prabhupada writes, in this case, to one of his disciples who was intimate with the Beatles and who first gave Krishna consciousness to the Beatles, indirectly, of course, because Prabhupada was the actual Shiksha Guru for everybody. But we see that the provision wasn't met, therefore the benediction was not attained. Now we go to January of 1970. So this would have been a half a year before the GBC was formed. So this letter was dated on my birthday in 1970. So he says to one of his leaders here, who was the temple president of the East Coast Center, he says, "If you go on with your work sincerely by following the footsteps of our predecessors, certainly our movement will be recognized by the people in general." So this means that both the public and government are gradually appreciating our position. And there's no doubt about it, if our motives are sincere, they will do it more and more. If our motives are sincere. What went down in the spring of 1978 shows that the motives were not sincere. And do we have any tangible examples that the people are flocking to Krishna consciousness at this time? Or at any time in the last 38 years? Do we have any tangible examples that the governments of the Western world are accepting Krishna consciousness? We have no such examples. The people in general are moving away from anything Eastern, particularly devotional Eastern teachings. And the government has made no move whatsoever towards accepting Krishna consciousness. The people in general are not listening to Krishna conscious radio stations or television programs because there aren't any. By now, if the movement had been developing in the right way, there would be a bare minimum of 4 major radio stations with big torchlight outreach that would be dedicated to Krishna consciousness, so wherever you were in America, you could turn on the radio and almost certainly reach one of them. The devotees would have a television station all of their own by now, if the motives had been actually sincere. So here we get to understand, through using logic in a different way, by seeing the reverse end, that since the benediction was not attained, then something else must be going on in relation to the motives. And we've had plenty of demonstration of those bad motives over the years, especially in March of 1978, but certainly not limited to that in any way, shape, or form. So now, as we move into 1971, the governing body was created in July of 1970, and here Prabhupada writes to his governing body commissioner of Southern California, who in 1971 it could be postulated that this particular devotee was the prominent devotee of Prabhupada in the movement in terms of influence. So Prabhupada writes a letter to him on the very first day of 1971, setting the tone for the whole year. If you all keep to the standard practices of pure spiritual life as I humbly instructed you, there is no doubt that this Sankirtan movement of Lord Chaitanya will overtake all the earth, and all opposing parties will be cracked down to nothing. Now, we don't want to emote on this letter. Prabhupada was the most loving person on the face of the earth. He's talking about demoniac parties that are opposed to Krishna consciousness. He's not talking about sentimental spiritualists who yet are not personalists, etc. But he's saying that the opposing parties, with their concocted philosophies, their concocted ways, their misinformation, their disinformation, their black ops, and anything that they can do to keep Krishna consciousness under wraps, that they would be cracked down to nothing. There's no indication that they've been cracked down to nothing now in 2016. They're still all very powerful. Arguably, they're more powerful than they were in 1971. So here again, was the provision met? If you all keep to the standard practices of pure spiritual life, things were watered down even while Prabhupada was here. People were going out in a deceptive mindset with wigs, and Prabhupada never wanted that. And using all kinds of deceptive techniques in order to get books out, but really in order to get revenue, such as the change-up, which was actually taught as a science until one of the prominent leaders of the movement destroyed the tape. The science of how to rip off the Vikharmis through the change-up. This is not pure spiritual life. Again, the rationalization is it was dovetailed. The books got out. Yes, a great deal of book distribution took place in the mid and late 70s. There's no doubt about it. But you have to look at the long-term picture. Book distribution was doubling starting in 1974 up through 1978, perhaps even in 1979. I'm not certain about that. But now book distribution has shriveled for the last many decades because the pure spiritual life that should be the foundation of the whole thing was completely compromised in order for these short-term results, particularly with focus on quote-unquote Lakshmi points. But where did all that revenue go? Was it actually utilized in pure spiritual life? Actually, it was utilized for the 11 Pretender Mahabhagavats starting in the spring of 1978. The point of the matter is that the world would be very different right now, very different, if the leaders, in particular, had kept to the standard practices of pure spiritual life with pure spiritual motives. But they did not do so. This is a letter written by Prabhupada to one of his female disciples in February of 1972. It actually corresponds with the day I moved into the temple at Madison, first moved in. Prabhupada writes to her, "I am an old man and I have inclination for philosophy and translating, and if all day and night I am reading and answering and signing letters, then I cannot utilize this at the fag end of my life to give you so many nice literatures like the Vedas, Upanishads, Puranas, Ramayana, Mahabharata, and other books in our Gaudiya line like Rupa Goswami, Sanatana Goswami, Vishwanatha Chakravarti, and others. So if the GBC, which I have appointed for this task, will kindly now assist me in this way by handling very expertly and with all good consideration all matters of management, I shall devote my full time to giving you further nice books." In other words, he wanted to delegate the management to the governing body commission, which was meant to be the ultimate managing authority after he departed. But management must be done in an authorized way. It must be according to the standard practices of pure spiritual life. It must be according to pure spiritual motives. Let's look at what he's offering here. Give you so many literatures like the Vedas. For all practical purposes, I don't know that Prabhupada translated any of the Vedas. I'm not including the Upanishads, of course, because he translated Sri Ishopanishad, but I'm talking about the Vedas. He then says Upanishads separately. He gave one Upanishad. It was already out by this time. By February 72, the Sri Upanishad had been produced and circulated for years. He didn't give any more Upanishads. Puranas. Prabhupada never translated any of the Puranas except the Bhagavad Purana, Srimad Bhagavatam, and that only to the beginning of the 10th canto in terms of verse, transliteration, translation, and purport. He certainly didn't translate the 11th and 12th cantos, and he said he was going to translate the Padma Purana, but he never did. It was all provisional. Ramayana. Prabhupada never translated the Ramayana into English for us. Mahabharata. He didn't translate the Mahabharata into English for us. Other books in the Gaudiya line, such as Vishwanath Chakravarti, Prabhupada never translated any of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's literatures. He wanted to do this. Prabhupada wanted to stay with us for at least 100 years. But he departed, for all practical purposes, 2 decades before that time. He departed prematurely, as did his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Goswami Maharaj Prabhupada. And they frankly departed for the same reasons. Namely, that their neophyte devotees were taking over their movement and utilizing their movement for their own personal ambitions. So he says here, if the GBC, which I have appointed for this task, what task? Namely, is that take care of all these questions. Let them all bring their letters or personal questions to you, and you answer them for me. In fact, earlier in this letter, Prabhupada says, I have given them everything, so they shall be able to answer all questions, and if they cannot answer from their experience, then I have given the answer in my books. If they cannot answer from their experience. He said he gave them everything. They should be able to answer from their experience if their experience is dedicated bhakti yoga activities, instead of climbing the rungs of the bureaucracy, taking advantage of their reputation by the strong service that they did in the early years, and getting to the top of the turtle tank and keeping everybody else down. The campus politics that was rampant in Prabhupada's movement, even when he was still physically present, what to speak of after he departed. The provision was not met. If the GBC, if, he doesn't say, certainly the GBC, which I have appointed for this task, will assist me in this way. He doesn't say that. He says, if the GBC, which I have appointed for this task, will now kindly assist me in this way, by very expertly handling all these matters of managing, I shall devote my full time to giving you all these further nice books, which he just listed, of which the vast majority he didn't give. That means his statement, which was made that I have the inclination to give you so many nice literatures, was provisional. And the provision was not met, because he still had all the headaches of managing. Even in the later years, you could even argue that because of the infighting of his leaders, the headaches were worse. The management responsibilities and heaviness that was put on him by all of this chicanery and rascaldom for the purpose of fulfilling personal ambitions. It was even more managing that he had to do just to keep the thing afloat. So the 7th letter here that we're going to discuss, where Prabhupada says, if you, the elder disciples, cannot manage things, then what is the future of the society? Why he would even write this if he was not foreseeing the strong possibility, or perhaps probability, that it was all going to go downhill in a big way after he departed. He writes this to one of his temple presidents in Florida. April 19th of 73. If you, the elder disciples, cannot manage things, then what is the future of our society? My business now is to sit down and write my books, and I am requesting you all to please cooperate with me in this endeavor. Well, to some degree, perhaps you could say they did, but to a significant degree, they didn't. But let us just go over this heavy-duty sentence here. If you, the elder disciples, cannot manage things, then what is the future of the society? This is a provisional warning, and most unfortunately, the provision was met, particularly in the spring of 1978. So then, as he knew he was going to be leaving soon, he went to New York City to have a tremendous Rath Yatra festival. I happened to be present for that, and in 1976, it was colossal. It was huge, right down Fifth Avenue. But while he was there in the temple at New York City previous to it, in the middle of July, he had an interview with 2 Newsweek reporters. Room conversation, I presume. So one of them says to him, "Can you tell me a bit about the future direction of the movement, how you plan to expand?" This was certainly arranged by Paramatma that this question would be there because Prabhupada would leave in just a little over a year after that. So Prabhupada responds, "That is going on already, just like these boys. They did not know about Krishna some years ago, but they are now taking seriously the same process. If it is continued, then people will take." Was the same process continued? Prabhupada said, "Regular guru, that's all." Did we have regular gurus after Prabhupada departed? Or did we have pretender Mahabhagavats? That is, of course, a rhetorical question on my part. Tattvamasi. The false ego of a materialistic identification is controlled by the demigod Rudra, who is an incarnation of his lordship Shiva. Now, in our disciplic succession, when a devotee leaps above his adhikar and pretends to be advanced when in fact he isn't, or pretends to even be very advanced and fully liberated and fully in love with Krishna when in fact he isn't, he's known as a sahajya. From the perspective of ignorance, a sahajya is caught in a finer version of ignorance. Of course, he does more damage than the Joe Schmo with his six-pack sitting on the couch. But nevertheless, when a sahajya thinks himself supreme, either as Jagat Guru or Sakshat Hari or both, for him, that's the last snare of the illusory energy. The 11 pretender Mahabhagavats were all totally immersed under the thraldom of Lord Rudra and false ego, both individually and collectively, when they imposed upon all of their god brothers and god sisters in the late 70s and even the early 80s their own worship in arbitrarily devised zones where they became despots of those zones. Some were more despotic than others, granted. But the fact is that they were all under the spell of a version of the mode of ignorance. So Lord Rudra utilized them to do what the mode of ignorance does. The mode of ignorance is the destructive mode of material nature. So he used them to destroy the very essence of the movement that they had come to control in previous years. He used them to take away the essence of the Krishna consciousness movement, particularly when they imitated Mahabhagavata. In point of fact, I talked to one of these 11 men, in my opinion the best of the lot, in 1988 in California, and he admitted to me that we went way too far and we couldn't pull it off. That was his quote. They went way above their adhikar. And therefore, all the benedictions that Prabhupada had indicated in his letters were made null and void because of these motivations, these bad motives, where the standard practices of pure spiritual life were no longer being followed like they were in the beginning of the movement. Srila Prabhupada, granted, left his ISKCON movement provisionally in the hands of his leading secretaries of the governing body commission. The GBC, he hoped, would be able to carry out the mission after he departed in the way that he authorized, regular guru, that's all, for example, and in the way he wanted. We all know now that they did not. We all know now that they do not. We know now, we should be able to see that the future of the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation is bleak, primarily due to the inability of the governing body commissioner to manage the movement properly, particularly after Prabhupada departed. When we read these letters or room conversation translations where Prabhupada uses the preposition if, we need to understand the proper application of the Guru's provisions, as opposed to a wrong understanding, such as a misunderstanding that the Vedic text can be accepted as provisional authority. We need to not delude ourselves and think that when Prabhupada uses the preposition if, he's stating a definite fact, because in most cases he's stating a potential benediction. And then when he gives a warning, we need to know that perhaps that very thing is what went down. The Supreme Personality of Servitor Godhead, His Lordship Shiva, will destroy that which is false in the name of pure devotional service. And we are being given in these sessions, these 4 sessions, 28 if, where we discuss 28 examples of the preposition if, indicating the Guru's provisions. We are being given an explanation of the proper understanding and application of the Guru's provisions. And any other understanding which contradicts this must be considered unfounded. It will wind up in absurdity, and it is under the thraldom of the mode of ignorance. Tamasi ma jyotir gamaha. Come out of the darkness. Step into the light. Sadeva Samya.